Just why exactly has the Trump administration launched a new phase in the long-standing war on drugs? In recent months, the US military has started destroying boats suspected of carrying illegal drugs. But while the White House presents this as a decisive response to the problem of trafficking, there appears to be far more to it than this. So, what exactly explains this sudden escalation, and why might it in fact lead to far more uncertainty and insecurity, not just in the United States, but internationally? Hello and welcome. My name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, and security. From time to time, governments will turn ordinary policy issues into matters of national security. What was once seen as a domestic concern becomes an urgent existential threat requiring extraordinary action. Known as securitisation, this process tends to follow a very specific pattern. First, the country's leadership will declare that something poses a fundamental danger to the state. Once the public accepts this, measures that otherwise would be politically or legally unacceptable suddenly become possible. A classic example of securitisation is the US war on drugs. For 50 years, successive presidents have portrayed illegal drugs as threats not just to public health or social order, but to the nation's very survival. But while this has long been used to justify militarised policing and even foreign interventions, it's reached a new level of intensity under the second Trump administration. As drug cartels become terrorist organisations and trafficking is reframed as an attack on the United States, the US military has started targeting boats in international waters, often with little or no evidence presented to justify its attacks. But what exactly lies behind this new phase in the war on drugs, and just why is it so destabilising? To understand what's happening, we need to look at the scale of the US drug problem. The United States is the world's largest market for illicit drugs. Dominated by cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and now fentanyl, estimates suggest that the trade could be worth anywhere between $150 and $700 billion a year. Aside from the devastating human toll, with the fentanyl epidemic alone claiming tens of thousands of lives annually, the flow of drugs fuels violent crime, corruption, and social disintegration. Domestically, drug-related violence, property crime, and overdoses place enormous strain on police, healthcare, and social services. Meanwhile, America's drug problem also fuels instability in other ways. Gang violence and organised crime across the countries used to produce and transport the drugs often forces people to flee, leading to increased migration to the United States. And it's all this that provides fertile ground for securitisation. Our story really begins in the early 1970s, as the use of drugs grew amidst social unrest, anti-Vietnam War protests, and a growing counterculture. President Richard Nixon declared that substance abuse was the #1 public enemy. Shifting from a focus on health, he reframed the issue as a national threat. In addition to greatly expanding federal policing powers, he established the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. But while this blurred the line between crime control and national security, it was under President Ronald Reagan that the issue became truly militarised. As crack cocaine spread, Reagan linked drug use to crime, moral decay, and foreign enemies. As a result, alongside harsh new domestic policies such as tougher sentencing, asset forfeiture laws, and increased police powers, the so-called war on drugs also became increasingly entwined with US foreign policy. Played out against the waning years of the Cold War, the US funded and trained foreign militaries across Latin America to combat drug production and trafficking, often run in conjunction with counterinsurgency operations against left-wing groups. The war on drugs became part of Washington's fight against communism. All this meant that by the end of the 1980s, drugs were no longer a domestic issue. They had steadily become a transnational security threat, demanding military solutions. This militarised approach would continue over the following decades under both Republican and Democratic presidents. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush ordered US troops to invade Panama to remove the country's leader, Manuel Noriega. But while Washington justified the move on the grounds of national security, arguing that Noriega had turned Panama into a narco-state, it was condemned internationally, with the UN General Assembly passing a resolution calling it a flagrant violation of international law. And while the Clinton administration took a slightly less militarised approach, it nevertheless maintained strict enforcement policies at home and abroad. Meanwhile, following 9/11, George W. Bush fused the war on drugs with the so-called war on terror, describing cartels as criminal insurgencies threatening the homeland. But despite all this, by the late 2000s, it appeared as if things were changing. As frustration grew following decades of failed crackdowns, Barack Obama attempted to desecuritise drug policy by framing addiction as a public health issue rather than a national security threat. But while his administration expanded treatment and harm reduction efforts, it didn't dismantle the underlying security infrastructure. Meanwhile, following on from this, the tough rhetoric returned during the first Trump presidency. Portraying the southern border with Mexico as a national emergency, drugs were directly linked to immigration and crime. And most recently, while President Joe Biden once again prioritised public health, expanding addiction treatment and harm reduction, the security dimension never disappeared. And it's this that brings us to the present. Having raised the drug issue during his election campaign, in September 2025, Trump announced that the US military had begun launching attacks against boats suspected of carrying drugs in the Caribbean Sea and Eastern Pacific, claiming that the strikes were based on intelligence linking the boats to Latin American cartels operating from Venezuela. Pete Hegseth, the secretary of the newly renamed Department of War, described the strikes as necessary acts of national defence. But while the administration has been trumpeting the strikes as evidence of its tough new policy, the attacks have caused an outcry. Carried out in international waters and thus outside US jurisdiction, critics have stressed that they amount to the illegal use of force in breach of the UN Charter and maritime law, which prohibit the use of force except in self-defence or with Security Council approval. Moreover, reports the attacks have targeted fishermen have raised further concerns that they're simply illegal and unjust extrajudicial killings that ignore all due process. Meanwhile, the fact that the strikes have been conducted by the US military and have taken place without explicit congressional authorization have led many to argue that they represent a dangerous overreach of presidential power. All this in turn adds to the growing concerns about Trump's authoritarianism. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do give it a like and perhaps consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. So, just why has Trump taken this approach? There are in fact several possible answers. First, and most obviously, there's the argument that this merely marks a robust new approach to dealing with America's drug problem. With overdoses surging, a forceful response plays well with Trump's political base. Indeed, despite the legal and constitutional issues raised, the attacks have proven popular amongst Republicans, and even many Democratic voters seem to approve of the tactics. But there appears to be far more to the attacks than this. Most obviously, it does in fact appear to reflect another example of Trump's efforts to expand presidential power. By securitizing drug trafficking in this new way, it seems he's trying to accumulate extraordinary powers in the name of protecting national security. Meanwhile, given Hegseth's apparent obsession with lethality and power projection, portraying drug traffickers as narco-terrorists not only legitimises the use of military force, but also allows him to blow up drug boats in dramatic televised clips that project the hard man image he desperately craves. It also sends the message that the United States answers to no one and will not be bound by international law. But while all this may seem to be plausible reasons for what we're seeing, there also appears to be another rationale. Many believe that the operations aren't only about drugs and power projection. The escalation of the US military presence near Venezuela, coupled with Trump's evident hatred of the country's Maduro regime, suggests a broader agenda that seems deliberately designed to frame the Venezuelan government as complicit in drug trafficking and thus open the way for more intense action. In other words, the escalating war on drugs may in fact be a prelude to regime change, a topic I'll come back to in the next video. In the meantime, whatever the underlying reason for the attacks, this new phase of the war on drugs raises worrying questions. While the United States has previously violated international law, not least of all when it invaded Panama, this appears to go much further than previous actions. On top of everything else that's happening in the United States, it marks another step towards the subversion of basic principles of the rule of law and democratic governance. But it may also have far wider consequences. Leaving aside the arguments that it may yet be a prelude to US military action against Venezuela, the US strikes represent the erosion of fundamental international norms. By attacking foreign vessels in international waters, the US is not only normalising the idea of extrajudicial killings and abandoning fundamental principles of justice, but it's also opening the way for others to follow suit. And it's for all these reasons that the dramatic re-securitization of the war on drugs is so dangerous, not just to the United States, but far more broadly. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.